Now that Billy Joe Saunders is obviously licking his wounds from his loss to Canelo, some fans have been asking her who do they think that Billy Joe Saunders should fight next? Like where does he go from here? Now, a possible path for him is just to retire. He's made probably about 10 million in his fight against Canelo. If you take into account everything, his base purse and his pay-per-view numbers and everything into account, sponsorship deals, all of that, he probably made about 10 million. After you take away taxes and training expenses, he's probably left with 5 million. If you take into account up to all the fights that he's had before he got the Canelo fight, he probably made 2-3 million in his career after all expenses. So he's walking away from the game with probably about 10 million in the bank. So with that type of money, and obviously the Canelo fight was probably the biggest fight that he's likely to ever have, because Canelo is such a huge star in Mexico. Obviously, if he was to have a fight against Golovkin is not as big a star as Canelo. If he was to have a fight against Andrade isn't even as big as Golovkin, let alone Canelo. So from a money perspective, obviously there is good money fights against the likes of Chris Eubank Jr., but he's not going to get paid 10 million against fighting Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank is nowhere near as big a star as Canelo, so he's reached a monumental high in his career. That was a peak in his career in terms of a super fight, fighting the likes of a Canelo. Obviously, he got paid handsomely for it, but for a lot of fighters, when they reach that peak and they know there's not likely to be anything that could surpass that in terms of a challenge, they lose a lot of motivation. Now, Billy Joe Saunders is a fighter that's been known to be a fighter that loses motivation. Generally speaking, he needs a challenge to actually get him up for fights. Otherwise, he doesn't look that good. So obviously, he's probably not going to reach like a super fight status on the level of fighting the likes of a Canelo. It could happen. There could be another superstar fighter that comes around that becomes a huge star, and Canelo might get a shot against him, but it's unlikely to happen. Canelo is probably one of the few last superstars in the game. Obviously, the other one is AJ, and you could probably put Tyson Fury on that list as well because of his profile in America at this moment in time. But there are still some options on the table for Billy Joe Saunders if he wants to continue fighting. Obviously, he needs to recover from his eye surgery, and obviously just recover in general, because psychologically it's a lot to take, fighting on such a high level and then losing like that. Truth be told, though, he did do well against Canelo, even though he lost the fight the way he did. For a couple of rounds, he did look good in there against Canelo. It was competitive. It wasn't just a whitewash. It wasn't a fight where Canelo was having it all his own way. Obviously, Canelo dominated in the end and managed to knock him out. But before that, there was a couple of rounds where Billy Joe Saunders did look good in there. So he does have a couple of options on the table. One option for him is to fight the likes of Chris Eubank Jr. Obviously, a fight against Chris Eubank Jr. for the British public would probably sell. He's not going to make as much money as he made against Canelo, because neither of them are that big of a star, but he could probably walk away with a good 1 million, 2 million for a fight like that against probably more than that, probably 3-4 million maybe. It's not as big as a 10 million pound payday, but it's still a decent payday, and it's a fight he could win. Stylistically, obviously he's a mover, while Eubank Jr. is more of a pressure fighter, so it's an interesting fight for him. It's a fight that he could potentially have, and he could potentially make some money off that fight as well. Another option for him is to fight Demetrius Andrade. Now, Demetrius Andrade, I think, would have beaten Billy Joe Saunders. I feel like if you're stylistically, he's got a very similar style to Billy Joe Saunders. Billy Joe Saunders is a slick southpaw, so is Demetrius Andrade. The difference is Demetrius Andrade has a similar style to Billy Joe Saunders, but his actual physical capabilities are a lot more. So he's got a longer reach, he's taller, he's just as slick as he is, and because of the longer reach, I think he would have just outboxed Billy Joe Saunders. Obviously, Billy Joe Saunders will probably have to go forward and apply pressure, but because of his longer reach and the fact that he's taller, I think he just, in terms of physical capabilities, he would have gave Billy Joe Saunders problems. So yeah, that's my opinion on that particular fight. A fight against Demetrius Andrade would have been interesting. He could potentially fight him. Obviously, the first fight fell through because of the failed drug test. So that's two options on the table. He does have Billy Joe Saunders, and he does have Demetrius Andrade. Obviously, Demetrius Andrade is struggling to get opponents at the moment, so he probably would take a fight against Billy Joe Saunders if Billy Joe Saunders is able to get a win in his next fight. He's obviously looking for opponents, and obviously I think Eubank Jr. would want to fight him as well. So that's a potential fight there. Another fight is Golovkin. Now Golovkin is coming towards the end of his career now, and I think Golovkin is looking for fights against fighters that have titles, and he's looking for the big money fight. So it's not likely that Golovkin would fight Billy Joe Saunders, because Billy Joe Saunders at this moment in time brings nothing to the table. He doesn't have a title. He's just coming off a loss against Canelo. So what's in it for for Golovkin at this moment in time? There's nothing in it for him to take that fight. But you never know, it could happen. It's a potential option that's on the table. And that could be a fight where it's a potential option that's on the table. I don't think there'll be a rematch between Canelo and Billy Joe Saunders because of how conclusive the ending of that fight was. Obviously, Billy Joe Saunders' corner threw in the towel, so you just can't get above that. And on top of that, you've also got maybe a fight against Murata or something of that sort. It could happen, but I don't know if Murata will fight the likes of Billy Joe Saunders after he's coming off a loss. So there is a couple of options out there for him. Obviously, he probably needs to recover first and then get back on the horse and start probably get one or two more wins on his record before he can get another fight. But I don't think he embarrassed himself in there against Canelo. Obviously, Canelo is the pound for pound king and the best fighter in boxing at this moment in time. He commands the most money, and on top of that, he's basically he's considered by many to be the top pound for pound fighter on the planet. So he done well considering what he was up against. He went to the hometown of he obviously fought in that stadium, and the stadium was all pure